Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast, a special episode, a panel episode, this time a space panel episode. But, you guys were all introducing yourselves off air, and you kind of gave a brief description about yourselves, which was actually going to be my question to start off the podcast, which was why everyone got interested into the area of space. You guys all have different areas where you guys focus, and we've had separate conversations on separate episodes with you guys. I've had a few more conversations with Heystek, and we've dived into the sci-fi realm a little bit. Andreea has entertained a little bit of it as well too. And Stephen, of course, we always talk about, exoplanets and other things, but I wanted to get Stephen, if you wanted to start first, and then Andreea, then Heystek. Why did you guys get interested in space?
Well, I grew up in outback Australia, and my teenage years were during the glorious '80s decade, which I'm very sorry, Robbie, but you seem young enough that you probably didn't experience that decade.
I had a boom box.
Oh, you did. But like I said, I grew up in outback Australia, where I had a fantastic view of the night sky. So that got me interested in astronomy when I was very young. But also during that time, NASA was sending a lot of probes to the outer solar system. So there were the Pioneer spacecraft and the Voyager 1 and 2 spacecraft. And Voyager 2 flew past Jupiter, Saturn, and then in 1986 it flew past Uranus. 1989 it flew past Neptune, and the images being returned from that just got me really enthralled about this whole discovery of things that we had as a civilization really had never seen before. So that was what really from a very young age got me focused on astronomy.
To me, I guess, well, I'm totally the opposite. I grew up in a busy city. I didn't get to see much of the sky. And my background was mostly into physics. So we didn't have a lot of astronomy background in those days in my country. But in the final year of my physics degree, I get this optional astronomy course, and I was completely hooked. I think the teacher didn't actually knew much about it, like it was all over the place, but I think it was quite the right introduction into astronomy. I was like basically just wide-eyed and just absorbed everything about astronomy. And then I knew I wanted to go into academia, so I thought, why don't I try with a master's degree in astronomy? And that's when I went abroad. And from then on, I just step by step, I just went on to do a PhD and then a postdoc and so on. So I basically got hooked into this field. And I think another thing that came about when I was in university was this boom into computers. And obviously computers have been around for a long time, but it was just about the time when computers were applied to science and to modeling. So I really like the idea of simulating things on a computer. So this is what I ended up doing, simulating galaxies on computers, and it's actually quite fun.
Yeah, and now it's my turn. So from very little, I'm interested in sci-fi. I'm in South Africa, in the Johannesburg region. I grew up in one of the suburbs of Johannesburg. And here in South Africa, we had some really nice night skies. And then from there on, I got interested in astronomy, and especially with the sci-fi aspect of astronomy. And I went to university. I did undergrad in computer science as well as electronic engineering. And in my final year of electronic engineering, I got to do a astronomy project. And from there on, I decided I like academia, I like doing research, I like science. So I did a master's in astronomy and is currently enrolled for a PhD in astronomy. And here I am now, and I'm probably one of the biggest sci-fi fans. I like to advocate for science, and I won't stop talking about it.
I might say something that might be a little bit controversial, but through digging through historical records of things and looking through over a number of documents, I've came across this overwhelming interest in not only some historical moments, obviously like JFK, but things when it comes to historical value of how interesting that even space was to people back then. Not only just specific moments in history to talk about the space race or something, but there seems to be an overwhelming interest to look up at the stars and also question things that could be possibly out there. And we've gotten to a point now in the world where our interest is still the same. In some cases, it's even better. I think a lot more people are getting interested into the topic just on the basis of UFOs and stuff. But something at a predated point, we would have looked at sci-fi television or sci-fi movies to spark up some interest in that as well, too, unless you had a telescope outside to look up at the stars. But the point that we're at now today, where the interest is not only going from what else could be out there, it's still that same question, but also there's a different aspect of now we have planetary civilizations. We have the ideas of exoplanets. We have the idea of great dark matter. We have the idea of so many other things out there where I start wondering, what are your thoughts on all of these things? I mean, do you think that society has really changed in the aspect of how it views space? I mean, we understand it more, but do you think that the general interest is still the same? Because I mean, I would probably make the argument that it is. I think when we look at what we know now compared to what we knew back then, it's expanded largely, and it's only still expanding largely. But we have a thing about us as people, I feel like, my own opinion, that we're trying to always discover something new. We're always trying to look to something new. We're always trying to find something new. And it's gone even deeper to not only being able to classify what these new things are and being able to discover something that could hold more new things in it. We're also looking at ways that we can categorize them for now at this point as well to usage purposes. Instead of looking at discovering a new planet, there's been talks and ideas of discovering a way to be able to live on that new planet. And I mentioned to you guys off air the question I was pulling from Steven's podcast, which I'll relate to everyone here so no one feels left out, but was an aspect of when you talk about Mars, should Mars just be strictly for historical value? Should it just be something that we don't? And that's an interesting question, especially his answer was, he's asking his students about this. And you start getting into this aspect of like, we all have this interest in, discovering space and understanding it. But now the question is now being asked of what do we do with this thing that we have discovered? Which if you would have said that same question 50 years ago, people go, what? We just landed on the moon, man. Like there's this whole aspect of like, it's that time change where it makes me speculate what the next 50 years is. And I said a lot there, but feel free, anybody, to rip it apart and compact it, do whatever you want.
So I think I can.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
No, you sure, Stephen? Yeah, so one thing I can say, so in South Africa, astronomy had quite historical roots. So when the Dutch East Indian Company back in the 1600s started looking for new routes to get to India to get spice back to Europe, South Africa, or the Cape of Good Hope, was chosen as a halfway station. And there, one of the first observatories was set up. And the astronomer that ran the observatory had a title, His or Her Majesty's Astronomer, from the British government. And that was set up to get better star charts from the southern hemisphere for ships navigating around the Cape of Good Hope. And from there on, the observatory expanded, and instead of creating different star charts, they started actually observing different objects in the night sky that wasn't visible from the northern hemisphere. Then from there on, more observatories popped up across South Africa. There's one in Bloemfontein, one in Johannesburg. And then in the 60s, I'm going to see here, just move out the way my background, the RTBS2 Radio Astronomy Observatory was actually originally built to do tracking and telemetry on the Apollo spacecraft. So now astronomy went from, okay, we observe, we only want star charts for navigation, to we are studying the space. Now we have people wanting to step foot on the moon, and we need a way to track those space vehicles. So 3 of these stations was built 120 degrees apart from others. So as the Earth rotated, one station were always looking towards the moon. And this was why this observatory was built. It formed part of NASA's Deep Space Network to track the Apollo spacecraft. After the Apollo program was finished, there was no use for the station as a tracking station, and it was converted into a radio telescope. And since then, the observatory has done research into a lot of aspects in astronomy. But you can basically think in a period of 400 years, it went from the stars was used for navigation purposes now to seeing what's out there to actually doing tracking in telemetry on spacecraft. So this station is still sometimes used to do tracking on and get telemetry from Mars rovers and assisting with a bit of the rover telemetry. The station was also used to assist with tracking telemetry of the NASA DART mission not too long ago. It was last year. So yes, this is where we are in astronomy. So yes, astronomy has a big historical footprint, but as science evolves and as we as humans try to think further, so what can we do next? What can we achieve next? And that is where astronomy is going. Astronomy will always be on that front end of what will be next. And that's why I think it's the quote from Star Trek, it's space, the final frontier. And that is where we are going. Space is the final frontier for us. We want to learn more about space and we want to explore space.
So I was just going to riff off of what you were saying, Robbie, about the interaction between science and culture and science fiction in particular. And like you, Heystek, I can talk about the science fiction connection forever. So, but I've looked a lot in the past about the history of science fiction and how it's evolved. And there's this interesting transition actually that occurred several hundred years ago because people have always been fascinated in the unknown, and for many years the unknown was largely in a spiritual sense and conjuring up ideas of ghosts and demons and so forth. But we saw this transition, particularly during the 19th century, where people started to think more about the unknown with respect to what science was doing, because science was progressing so rapidly. And so when you think about the history, like what was the first science fiction, that's a very controversial topic. But I mean, you could, for example, think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein as a really archetype example of science and the unknown and how it can go crazy. But of course, you mentioned Mars. And as you know, Robbie, I love Mars for many, many reasons. But I always think that Mars is underappreciated as the impact that Mars, both in terms of exploration and the effect on science fiction has had on culture. Because of course, as we know, the late 19th century, there was ideas about us, not just life on Mars, but an advanced civilization. And in the early 20th century, there was a substantial amount of the population who believed, based on what they had seen and heard and read in H.G. Wells, which was inspired by the science, that there was an advanced civilization on Mars and they were possibly out to get us, which is why the 1936 Orson Welles broadcast of H.G. Wells had such a profound effect. But Mars going forward, of course, we were able to look at Mars because it has a thin atmosphere and see, well, actually, there's not really much there. But that has ebbed and flowed up until the present day, where people are always looking at what are these unknown aspects, and in particular, are we under any threat, which is always a primary motivator behind the way people think about space. Because as Heystek said, there's Star Trek and numerous science fiction franchises which correctly portrays space as being the ultimate in terms of unknown. That's why they call it the final frontier. So I think that what we've seen over the last couple of decades, of course, with things like the X-Files and so on, and obsession with Area 51, it's related to the unknown, but also from a personal and national security sense, is there anything that we need to worry about? So that seems to be have been a huge motivator. So I think we're still there as we've gone forward, and as I said, we've found that Mars isn't a threat. So we don't seem to have any particular local threats, meaning in the solar system. But people are still very, very interested in this topic. And so now we're in the era of JWST, and possibly finding signs of life on another planet. That's the sort of thing that I think people will still really engage in from that perspective. So those are just a few of my thoughts.
Yeah, so I'd like to follow up on what Stephen's saying. Obviously, I think it's interesting, this boundaries between science and the culture and society. And it obviously, when we don't have enough facts, we as humans, we have a tendency to fill in with our imaginations and our cultural background. And it's nothing wrong with that. It's always been the case when we didn't know something, we, even in the old maps, well, like the Earth, for example, wasn't mapped, wasn't known completely back in the day. So there was a region where it was like, here are the dragons, right? So now we have the Earth well mapped, but there are parts of the universe which we don't actually know very well. For example, our own galaxy is only mapped to a fraction, like 10% or something. And again, we have regions where here are the dragons, right? So scientists, we continuously push the boundary and try to fill in whatever regions they're filled in previously by imagination and folklore with scientific facts. But I want to kind of push back on this and say that I think yes, it's tempting to say that we are the first people, or that obviously there's a lot of progress in the past decades, but there's always been the case that humans were curious, and they're always wondering about, ever since we were born, we came conscious on this planet, we actually started to think about our place in the universe. I mean, it was inevitable, because I think back in the day, think about it, there was no pollution. The Milky Way was right there on the sky. It was this big thing on the sky that was hard to miss, right? And right since the beginning, people started to fill in the gaps with a lot of myths about where this big band of light came from. So I think there's always been this curiosity, and obviously I think even in I mean, it's not always like complete mystery. People have tried to apply science to what they were seeing. So even the ancient Greeks were able to calculate the curvature of the Earth, for example, with the limited knowledge they had. They actually were able to deduce that the Earth was round, and even calculate its radius. So that was amazing. And yeah, obviously since then we progressed. And when we set foot on the moon, obviously we were pioneers. We as a humanity were pioneers. We didn't know much about the solar system even back in the day. So it was very, I would say, dangerous mission in my view. It was a bit foolish to go without knowing where you're going, but there are people like that. Nowadays, when we go back to the moon and eventually on Mars and other places in the solar system, obviously we were better prepared and we know what to expect. And yes, I mean, there's lots of questions. Yes, what should we do when we get on Mars? Should we start terraforming or changing the Mars or habitat, turn into a habitat for people? I think that's to be decided. I don't know. It's first of all, I think Mars is not static. It's like Earth, right? Obviously, Mars has its own climate, its own. I know Stephen can fill in the gaps here, but it's hard to change a complex system that's always in the changing. So you have to kind of be a bit in sync with what's going on Mars. You can't just willy-nilly change everything you want. So yeah. And mentioning JWST, I think we are again at the verge of finding like a major step in our knowledge, increasing our knowledge of the universe, especially, for example, if we detect a lot of planets with water. And then right then we'll see there'll be a lot of speculation about life on other planets, and I would imagine we'll have all the facts immediately. So I would imagine the society will fill in the gaps with more with imagination and other stories, which is fine.
couple things I want to touch on. First off, I'm a moon guy. I'm a moon landing was fake guy. That's fine. That's my little thing. I don't fight a fight on it. I'm just saying. Maybe later we got there, but whatever. Okay. The second thing I would say is that I don't question the aspect of curiosity, but I started looking at the way that we've shifted in an aspect of I've heard from so many researchers compared to what we know, there's a vast amount that we don't not know. And as slowly as the unknown starts to become more known, we land in this area where I feel like we're at today in society, where our curiosity is still the same, but the idea that our understanding and comfortability have landed on two different levels. If I mention terraforming an exoplanet or another planet with an asteroid, you can roll your eyes at it, but there's people that take it seriously. Where I start wondering the information that the public is receiving when we're able to talk about these ideas, when it doesn't sound so much as sci-fi, depending on where you focus in, is that curiosity is not being affected, but it's I guess, the two fields of understanding and comfortability. People think that, you know, for instance, when the Mars rover landed, that was a big event. I was excited, but other people didn't really know. Like I thought we already did that. Okay, so your lack of information on where we're at, it seems like the information gap. The public thinks we might be somewhat farther ahead. Some people think we're somewhat far behind. But then we look at the James Webb Telescope, taking pictures of what we had pictures of before in a clear, more definitive. I mean, it looked like Trix yogurt to me. I don't know if anybody else felt that way. There's look at the swirls of it. It's just beautiful thing to look at. But then you start realizing there's a bunch of things out there that we have left to discover, and it brings a new aspect of hope. I don't question the curiosity, but I start understanding when we talk about different ideas of different what we would call sci-fi techniques of terraforming another planet or living onto another planet. For some people, it's more normal than it is sci-fi. And for the people that it's more sci-fi than it is normal, it gets into this aspect, is that our comfortability or is it our understanding of space? Is it headed in the correct direction? Are we having more comfortability on the aspect of information of where we're at technology wise? Or is our understanding of space farther than our comfortability, where we're understanding more and what's going to be more acceptable approaches of what our goals that we can look forward towards in the future, rather than something that could be maybe later down the line?
Well, as you know, Robbie, because we've spoken about this before, one of the main issues with what you're talking about is that there's almost no regulation surrounding it. We're entering this area where private space industry is starting to take over from government-run space or organizations, and that's concerning for a number of reasons. I mean, there are some space treaties, shall we say, about whether somebody can claim that the moon belongs to a particular country or something like that, but they're very vague, and it's difficult to know how they would be enforced if they were if those rules were broken. So when it comes to going to Mars, it's something which people think about from basically from a science fiction perspective, because Mars is very commonly portrayed in science fiction, The Expanse, and many other shows, which, by the way, it's almost always portrayed as a military base of some sort, which there's a whole history of Mars that goes into that. But if we're going to Mars and living on Mars, the way that Elon Musk talks about, then people just kind of think, oh, wow, that sounds very futuristic and very cool. And I'm not sure if I would do it, but it just sounds like we're entering into a sci-fi era. But there's the ethical component of that. Like, should anybody be allowed to just go set up a Starbucks on Mars? When you word it like that, it sounds kind of ludicrous, but that's the kind of question that we haven't adequately answered as a civilization. And that's why when I talk to my class about things like this and say, should we do this or should we go a different direction? Should we rein ourselves in and think about this? It's clear that people in the class have never thought about that. I've never thought about, it's that old line from Jurassic Park. We're so busy figuring out if we could, we never thought about if we should. So I think there's a lot of challenges. And don't get me wrong, there are people who are working on this. There are people who are making their careers just thinking about space ethics and about whether we should be terraforming Mars or colonizing space or even just mining asteroids. But this is it's something that we'll have to figure out at an international level. Otherwise, industry will lead the way, meaning that companies will make the decisions on this that obviously benefit their company. And that is a pathway that I think we need to be very careful about.
I don't fear billionaires a whole lot. I do have that aspect of fear that I share with you, but I also think that it could be done in a correct way as well too. I really just kind of rely on what people would say, like it's nobody takes an account for, like if there's a projection model, people say nobody takes an account for future people figuring it out or someone along the line. I'm like, you can put some weight in that. I wouldn't bet the farm, but some people would like to. But I land in this aspect where we get to this point of when we start being able to actually manifest or do some of these things, like colonize on another planet. If that trip or voyage ever does get to a point like that, there's just deeper questions among us that start to arise. You know, we want to know if there's other life out there. We don't toss it out. People still question about our origins. I think these are deeper underlying questions that we all have. No matter if you're a billionaire, no matter if you're a government, there's just these questions that need answers to. How does a planet keep its magnetic field and another planet lose it? Was it a specific event that happens? You know, it's this information we end up learning more about later. And if you would have like asked me just the general public about the James Webb Telescope and didn't know anything about what its capabilities could be, it's like, what does it take? I think I said it with you, Stephen. It just takes pretty pictures out there or something. But when you start understanding what it really does when it comes to pulling out information or understanding more, it gives me hope to answering the questions of our not just our origins, but just other aspects of origins when it comes to even the solar system being created. I think with Andreea, we talked about the creation, like the origin of the Big Bang, you know, the creation of this, using a simulator to be able to, you know, keep trying to, you know, randomly crank out what people would say would be a religious thing. You know, God rested on the seventh day, any of this type of, I don't know, I'm not religious, so that's going to be a hard example for me to toss out. But it's this question about where we come from, how things are created, and where does the direction go? Because with the understanding of what the past was, you also have to understand what the future is going to be. And I think that is sculpted not only by society, not only by billionaires, not only by government, but also information in the direction of what society is projecting at the time. And that's why I brought up the question of curiosity from the beginning. I mean, we have this fascination with space. I think that's an underlying measure amongst us all, with only questioning where we come from, who we are, what is consciousness, all these things. It's these underlying factors that seem to, I guess, propagate or come out through all of the other underlying factors when it comes to billionaires or money or funding. I think there's a hurdles, but I think there's a deeper need within every individual to have, like anybody, you show them pictures of the James Webb Telescope, what it's able to pull out. They're going to be astounded. They're going to be amazed, especially if you put up a comparison to what we had before. I mean, it's just how far we've gone, the progress, like just seeing that can give hope in anybody's eyes. So I think it starts pulling out these underlying factors of not just showing the general public more images like this or having more interactions or space conversations like we're having, but just kind of showing out that underlying factor that whether you know about this aspect of space, you are inherently interested in it. It's just something in your DNA that just is attracted to this understanding or this deeper question.
So what I can add to this is I would like us to see go in the utopian directions such as Star Trek. Like we are seeking out new life and new civilizations. And one question I usually ask the class I teach is, why do we study astronomy? And get some really interesting questions, but it basically comes down to we as a human species are a curious species. And we want to know what is out there. We want to know how stuff works. We want to know how stuff began. We are a curious species, and we want these types of questions answered. Sorry, my cat walked in
That was
front of the
great. It
camera.
scared the crap out of me, but that was awesome.
And that is what we want to do. So currently, yes, we can see industry leading the space race now. But if you think about it in that way, when governments are doing space exploration and vehicle launches into space, it's funded by governments. So if something goes wrong and your rocket blows up on a launch pad, then you need to go back to your government, either it's the Senate or Congress or Parliament or whatever part of the government, report back to them saying, this is what happened, can we please have more money to try it again? So that's why I think government is a bit cautious to make sure they get it right the first time. But with industry, they have more money available. So if a rocket blows up, oops, a rocket blow up, we just throw more money at a problem and build a new rocket. Where in government, that's a bit more tricky. If something blows up, you need to explain why it blew up, and you have to guarantee that it won't happen again. You can get funding to do it again. But I would like us to move the world to work together. And it's interesting I've spoken to my class about as well. If you go back to the 60s with the space race, more people were united behind it to get a common goal. And go a little bit forward, but go to World War II, just after World War II, the Manhattan Project with the first nuclear bomb. And that also sparked curiosity. And back then, there were a lot more people interested in science and technology due to those projects. But where we are today, it seems like there are less and less people interested in it. So, for example, you said the James Webb Telescope. Some people is not interested in it at all. They just see pretty pictures and, oh, that's it. But then you get other people that's really interested behind what's actually happening in this picture. What does this picture actually tell us? And it all comes down to, again, we as humans are a curious species, and to achieve more, all the countries and everyone have to set aside the differences, and we have to work for a common goal.
Yeah. Well, I think a lot has been said and kind of agree with both, but I want to kind of echo what Stephen was saying. I think there is, we have to think about these problems. Obviously, we can't set them, just ignore them. And I heard about we a lot. And the question, I think we need to find first what we is. Obviously, we all have aspirations, and we all want to study the universe and understand where we come from. And as an astronomer, I definitely have that in me, and I can see in other people. You don't have to be an astronomer to kind of ask these questions. And I think there's a inner desire of we of us. However, when it comes to actually space exploration, I think this we becomes a bit less well defined. I mean, obviously, you have to, when you go to Mars, you obviously have to deal with practicalities. Who's own the oxygen? Is we as a humanity are going to own the means of survival there? What happens? I mean, these are things, and it's not just Mars. Everything that happens in space at the Earth, around the Earth, is also well regulated. And I think there's been people have thought about this intensely. Yes, I think it's good to have. And Heystek was talking about this utopian future, and it's all good. It also could turn very dystopian if we're not careful about things. So I think, and we've seen this with the development of technology here on Earth, it's used for the good, but also could be easily turned into something that's not as good. And we are not always asked whether we wanted to go into that direction or not. So I think we know as astronomers things are very clear, but once you go into exploring space, you have to put together people from all walks of life with all different perspectives, and come with an agreement to what we as a species want to do. Of course, we all have this inner desire to explore and to know more about the universe, but it has to be done in a wise way, not just for us, but for future generations as well.
So if I could just make one more comment on this, because I want to push on this utopian thing, because I agree with you, Andreea, that such a thing could go south really, really quickly. And just to tell you a bit of a story about how I feel about Star Trek, because I like Star Trek, but at the same time I also hate it, or there was something about it that I just couldn't connect to, and I never really could quite figure out what it was until I saw the movie The Matrix, because there's a scene in The Matrix where Agent Smith has captured Morpheus and he's trying to interrogate him and get information out of him about where the city of Zion is. And while he's doing that, he reveals something to Morpheus. He says there were earlier versions of the Matrix, but they failed because they were too perfect, and the human mind rejected it as a result. And when I saw that scene, I realized, oh my God, that's why I can't connect to Star Trek, because Star Trek portrays this utopian future where all the governments have combined with this goal of exploring space. And for that reason, maybe it's the cynicism in me. I'm just too cynical about this, but it's very, very difficult for me to conceptualize that as a realistic possibility. If you imagine a million pathways of human civilization, Star Trek is picking the one case where a utopia actually works out in that way. And so I'll be interested to hear the thoughts of everyone about what would it take for human civilization to actually go down that one out of a million paths.
Well, I would say it's not, I guess, pessimistic to think that we'd land in a dystopian society. I mean, Earth's problems don't just go away because you left the atmosphere. That doesn't happen. Even putting me in a dome for however long with a certain amount of people, eventually I'm taking a gun to the dome and I'm getting what I want from whoever I want it from. It's just there's mental breaks in society. There's just things that it's hard to think that the problems just stop here on Earth and it's only an Earth problem and it won't transfer over. But I bring up the question is, don't you think that there would be something that would just, I think the whole reason I got interested in the alien topic in general was idea that there was something bigger than us out there that would cause us to all unite on a front where it's no longer just me against you. It's a we against them aspect of things. And necessarily doesn't need to be hostile all the time, but understanding that there's more out there than just this. I think that's the discovery of life. I think that would shake us out of that problem when we realize we're not the only ones in this universe. I know we talk about we can't be the only ones alone in this universe, but to see real evidence that there is something like us, maybe more advanced or less advanced on some levels, it's not only going to be interesting for us to go and find out what that is, but it unites us on a front. It's no longer countries or lines in the sand anymore. It's now people of Earth that are leaving to go inhabit another planet because there's other people or other things out there that are doing the same thing. I keep that little faith in humanity that there's something that would shock us to our core where we wouldn't be savages in this dystopian aspect that would unite us more towards a Star Trek front, I would say. But I think that comes from same reason you watch Star Trek and you realize they're going all around space, but they know about aliens, they know about monsters, they know about other things on other planets, things that could harm them. It's like I always relate to the Orville because it's a knockoff of Star Trek. I mean, they're working with aliens at some point. I mean, yeah, you become friends with them, but at some point you got this idea of what was that core element that caused them to land in this area or this, age of excellence, I would say. And I think that is from an aspect of understanding that it's not just me and you, it's we against them. And doesn't necessarily need to be seen as a bad way. It could be seen as a, progressive way as well, too. We don't need to fight, but we can try our best to match our intellects.
It could be, but the cynical side of me, the only solution to the question I posed that my cynical brain can come up with is this unifying aspect in a negative sense. And what I mean by that is, for example, I was at a conference a couple of months ago, an astrobiology conference, where I was talking with some of my colleagues just over a beer about there's a huge effort towards the search for biosignatures. That is the signature for biological activity on another planet. Not necessarily intelligent, just basic life as would have been on Earth, say a million years ago. Sorry, I said a million years ago, billion years ago. But there's also some of my colleagues who are searching for technosignatures. That is evidence of an advanced civilization. What we spoke about is what would be the societal response to the detection of a biosignature and the detection of a technosignature. And we more or less agreed that if and when we do discover a biosignature, then the societal response will be, wow, that's kind of cool, that there's life elsewhere, and good job, guys. It's something like that. The societal response to a technosignature, I think, would be far, far greater, to the level where it would be not just a societal response, it would be a government response. It would be a sudden sense of insecurity of, oh my God, there's intelligent civilizations out there. We need to get ready, because I've seen all the science fiction movies and we know how it works out. Maybe somebody had just finished watching Independence Day or something like that, right? So the only cynical pathway I see towards unifying is essentially a military response to being aware that there is intelligent civilizations out there.
Wait, are all my questions more focused on it? I just watched Independence Day, so I was like, I just watched it yesterday, I swear to you. But when it comes to like a techno signature, is it possible that if we did a signature on another planet and we came across some tech, for instance, that wasn't from another outer galactic civilization or something, but just something from China, something from, that can spark up insecurities between the American government or whatever government comes across that as well too. Like, for instance, it's always weird to me, like, even though the Mars rover or the rover landing on Mars was like publicized and everything, in my head, I had this thought of like, I hope we also have other tech on other things. This isn't just like the very first and we're publicizing it as so. I get like, it's cool, for the public, but like other countries see that as well too. And I start wondering, how come we're the only one that's focused in this direction, even though we all know that every country's interested in space. So someone's keeping whatever they're doing on the low, or not publicizing as much, so where I start going into this aspect of, is it just going to be a competitive aspect that gets us up into space? And then I start having questions. If we look to our billionaires to, venture off into space for us, does it get to a point where we're only going to have corporations, or the ideas of like, you could bring up the example of asteroid mining. We're calling asteroids $5 billion asteroids based on the materials that are involved in these asteroids. Okay, that's not how I want to see space be going, where we're just looking at it as a profit or business aspect rather than a industrial push, or not industrial push, but a civilizational push, just for society in general. It's not, that's not crazy thinking if I'm thinking like that, right? Like I'm low key wondering if there's other things that they're doing that they're not telling us about. I'm just hoping that there is, because the idea of us just publicizing a rover landing on Mars and everyone sees that, we're not looking at that as the world has just landed on Mars. At least a lot of the general public isn't. And you look at businesses probably not thinking that either. They're wondering how they can do that as well too, or they're looking at it like America just landed on Mars. And I think we have to drop those labels of we and this. It has to be more of a united thing on this thing if we talk about space exploration in general. I could be wrong in saying that, but that's okay. I don't have any PhDs.
So I agree with you. So I'm a bit of more of optimistic type of person. So I like the idea of a utopian future such as Star Trek or the Orville. I must say the Orville is sometimes better than being Star Trek than Star Trek itself. So that is great. I will give it to the Orville. But in those utopian futures, they have set aside the differences of mankind or humankind. And humankind is working to better themselves and towards a common goal. So looking at all different pathways that can lead to that one specific pathway means everyone on Earth basically needs to set aside their differences and work towards a common goal, a common endpoint. But that is quite a difficult task. If you think about the space race, when the first satellite, Sputnik, was put in orbit, the US response was not, oh, cool, it's a satellite in orbit. It was a war aspect, thinking if you can put a satellite in orbit, means why can't you put a warhead in orbit and bring it down onto a city? So there's always this military aspect as well in this exploration of space. But I agree with you. It will be great if we can put up a united front. So, for example, we have the first people landing on Mars. Not saying the US has landed on Mars or whichever country, but rather, for example, planting a united Earth flag, saying we as a human species arrived at Mars. And then, Stephen, coming to you with your techno-signatures, that's a question I've asked to my students as well. So what will happen to society? What will happen to the culture as we know it if we detect a techno-signature? And a few things that comes to mind is what will happen to cultural beliefs? And secondly is what will happen to religions if we say we picked up a techno signature and it means we have now a different civilization on a different planet. What does that mean to a society? What will that mean to the development of a society? And what we can think about it as the butterfly effect. What knock-on effect will that have on us as the human species? And what came to mind is the movie and the book Ender's Game, where you now try and send a force to a different planet. You are attacked by a species. Now you have to attack them back. And what will be that knock-on effect as from a human standpoint?
Well, the White House gets blown up and we lose Jeff Goldblum. Spoiler alert.
If I might just add again, I think we do have, we always in our history, we tended to have this human-centric view. And we always kind of, we have to be careful not to judge other beings in the universe with our template, right? Well, obviously, as a species, if we have any bit of introspection, we are very competitive and we always fought with each other, right? So that's kind of, maybe it's inescapable. I don't know, maybe, I know, we seem to go into the right directions, having fewer wars with time and everything, but we haven't broken the bad cycle of infighting. I think we are probably, I don't know much about biology, but it seems to be we're probably the only species on Earth who are basically killing each other, right? I don't know whether there's any other, apart from some weird spiders and stuff. So I think we definitely, if we are confronted with evidence of life, it doesn't have to be a big civilization. It's just even some algae or some bacteria on other planet. That would still be a big change in our way we see the universe, right? Even that would be that would have a knock-on effect on religion, right? Because there's all this idea of how God created the universe with us in it, right? So people already have thought about this, and I think NASA has even assembled church, religious leaders from all over the world to kind of think about these problems. What will happen? How will the world react when confronted with such an evidence, if there is evidence like that? So in terms of techno-signatures, I think it's interesting because, again, we approach this from a very combative view. We are a bit self-defensive here, right? So if we find a techno-signature, the immediate response would be, okay, let's get ready. What kind of arms do we have and what kind of weapons do we have? Are we ready? I think it's good to think from the other side as well. Obviously, I think if this is a very technologically advanced civilization, the fact that it survived for a long time, it already says something about it. The fact that they probably are, chances are they're wiser than us. I mean, we nearly escaped the Cold War and everything. And there was a time, right, when the space race was at the height that, there was literally people were thinking that us as human species may not survive, right? So we had close calls in the past, I think Heystek was showing the Drake equation, right? And Stephen knows all about it, right? Determining what's the likelihood of having civilization like us in a universe. And one factor in that Drake equation is the time span of a technologically advanced civilization or technical civilization. And in the past, people were thinking, especially in the Cold War, that this time span is very short, like a decade or 2 decades or something like that. And now we know we're better than this, so we ourselves survived. So chances are other civilizations are able to, or some of them are able to, extend the length of their civilization, which means they're not as combative as us. They basically grow up. And I think these are things which I think good to think about when we actually go and explore the universe. Kind of a step up from our own upbringing and trying to look from a different perspective.
I guess the message I'm not, I wouldn't say receiving, but the message I'm kind of trying to say out there is if you come across a techno signature of an advanced civilization, why would that be more amusing than coming across a new life form in the form of a bacteria or some type of smaller organism? I guess that's my main thing here is like I pull the same weight. I mean, it's more exciting if you can come across a creature, sure, but I also get the same excitement whether you tell me it's a new bacteria we discovered or a new civilization we discovered. I have the same joy in that aspect, and I don't think the public would receive the message the exact same. If you said that there were aliens on another planet, rock people, let's go with that one. I always hear that all the time. People like the thing from the Fantastic Four. But if you say that to people, they get super excited. But if you tell them that you just discovered a new maybe life or a biology organism when it comes to like a plant or when it comes to some type of small thing that you might have to see under a microscope, I mean, I pull the same excitement out of that. And I think there's a way to be able to make sure the public receives the message and has the same reaction as well, too. It doesn't mean you need to inflate things, you need to do anything of that sort, but it just needs to, any new discovery is an area and a direction. And the reason why I bring this up, and this is kind of like my biggest concern, is how the way the public receives this message is because it's the way that we choose to go deeper into the topics. Any type of thing you look at when they do experiments, if experiment fails early, there's not really a whole lot of necessary precautions that go into researching it more. And that's why we have some projects that end up going back into 10, 15 years later, end up getting redug back up, investigated again with proper new technology. And then they do end up going down that route where I go, I don't want to lead into this area of like, you look at a planet, you scan the surface of it, and just because you don't pick up a certain signature of an advanced civilization doesn't mean that there's no value on that planet. You see what I'm saying? Like, it's like, I wouldn't say it's about understanding, maybe for the general public, because that's where I'm in. I don't have a PhD to talk about astrology really, but my biggest concerns is when we talk about the area of neglect and what we choose to leave, in the basket or off to the side and put other bigger things on our horizons. I mean, things that are more profitable, we can all agree on, I think, are usually the things that get picked up the most. I mean, from a business standpoint, that's just strategic. If you say that there's a $6 billion asteroid you can mine compared to trying to find a new way of renewable energies, I'm going to 100% bet all my money on the aspect of finding the $6 billion asteroid. I'm just saying. Maybe I'm wrong, but I want to make sure that the change is headed in more towards a betterment of society or a betterment of human civilization, rather compared to this aspect where when people receive knowledge, I mean, we have people that are finding out tweet updates about Mars rover landing, touching down, and then other people saying that I thought we already did that already. I mean, there's a disconnect there between not only the information that they're receiving about space, but just the overall excitement that they should be having in discovering something new. I mean, we don't take that same comparison into our life when our favorite show comes on next week or the next season or whatever. And I feel like you should have the same. I don't know, maybe I'm like a optimist or hopeful in a sense of just, if you told me a bacteria that we discovered on another planet, I'm already trying to think of like, oh my God, what does it look like? Can I see under a microscope? Let me see. And then I'm pushing people out of the way to look at it. I have that type of excitement. I think that there's a way to get the general public interested in that too. And that's the start of a venture forward into what I would call the right direction. Because we talk about research, for instance, picking the profitable option compared to the research option. I think we would like to see a research option, but when it comes to business and the people that are funding these ventures, I mean, is it going to be the research option that gets chosen, or is it going to be the more profitable option? And I think that is in fault of how we've gone in a long time in society as well, too. It's always the profit margin.
Yeah, so that's what concerns me about this. First of all, I'll say that with biosignatures, I didn't want to undersell earlier how interested society would be in that. And as both Heystek and Andreea said, I think there'd be a lot of profound implications, even for basic life, on current culture and civilization, and in particular religion, there'd be a lot of discussion that would be going on there. But in terms of unifying people, and I was presenting my cynical case that it would need to be some kind of military response. And part of the template for that was something that Stephen Hawking thought a lot about in his declining years, because in the years before he passed, he was a very big advocate of us keeping a low profile as a civilization, because he thought that any aliens, if they knew we were here, that they would just step on us. And he was saying that as a British person, and a template for this is to look at the expansion of the British Empire, who were developing their technological capabilities, not for the subjugation of less technologically advanced societies, and as we know, they subjugated many of those kinds of societies. But that was not what they were developing the technology for. They were developing it for the people who were right on their doorstep. In other words, the French and the Dutch and the Portuguese and so on. And so that's why I see that as a similar kind of response. But having said that, I will say that any advanced civilization, and this was a point that was brought home to me recently by a colleague who works on technosignatures. He's actively thinking about this, and he has heard this argument that we should be keeping a low profile, minimizing radio signals into space, and even going so far as trying to develop cloaking devices so that alien civilizations can't even detect the Earth. He said that's kind of ridiculous, because any alien civilization, they're probably not just 100 years more advanced than us, probably many thousands of years more advanced than us. The JWST is just like a toy to them, and so they already know that we're here, almost certainly. And so he likened it to us trying to hide from an advanced civilization, as if you've ever seen a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old play hide and seek. They crouch down in the middle of the floor and cover their eyes and hope that you can't see them. He said that's what it would be like if we try to do that.
If I can't see you, you can't see me.
Exactly. So any advanced civilization knows that we're here. It's just a question of what their response. Do they even care that we're here? Maybe they do, maybe they don't. Maybe they just can't do anything about it because traveling between stars is so difficult. So you can go the military unifying response. Going any other direction, well, hopefully the utopian response, I think would require us to solve things like the wealth disparity which currently exists in the world. Because I'll tell you, whenever we, and I'm sure Heystek and Andreea have come across this as well before, whenever we try and get people excited about a new astronomical discovery, we get a lot of people who go, wow, that's amazing, like that's really inspiring. You also get a bunch of people who say, why on earth are we spending money on that when we still have homeless people and problems feeding the poor? You get both sides. I mean, even when the first images were publicized from JWST, the response, I heard the response of some people saying, well, that's great, but I'm still paying $6 to $7 a gallon for gas. That was their response. And so this is what enormous wealth disparity that exists in the world that we're going to need to solve first. I don't know how you do that in the framework of capitalism. So I'm not saying that we should become socialists, but or maybe I am. But that is going to be a hindrance to a utopian unifying response where everybody can get on board and say, yes, we should be investing in space exploration. Absolutely.
Well, that's why I was explaining the idea of being more profitable options that would be aimed for first, rather than looking towards more research endeavors as well, too. I think there's just
so either we solve the wealth disparity or companies take the lead. And I agree with you that that companies taking the lead on the profit margin is, I think, looking at the world as it currently is. Hopefully we can change things. But looking at the world as it currently is, seems to me to be the more likely outcome.
Yeah, that was interesting points. And one thing that popped into my mind now while talking about the military response and trying to cloak ourselves from other possible civilizations is the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where Earth is destroyed to make way for a superhighway in space. And that's just something that popped into my mind. But yes, I think for now, you are correct, Stephen, is one way to drive space science, space exploration is by private companies trying to make a profit of stuff. And I saw a white paper the other day for a proposed hotel module to be added to the International Space Station. So you can actually you can call it venture tourism, where you can actually go to the National Space Station for a vacation. I have another colleague, he's part of the idea for a African millimeter telescope. And he has a new proposal that's actually being considered now of building a telescope on Kilimanjaro, around about at 4,700 feet above sea level. Oh, sorry, not feet, meters above sea level. So one thing is, okay, cool, you can build a telescope on Kilimanjaro that will be above water vapor, and you can do some really cool science with it. But something interesting with it is you can now actually have venture tourism. So normal venture tourists wants to go to Kilimanjaro and climb Kilimanjaro. But what about the average tourist that wants to go to Kilimanjaro but is not fit enough and don't want to climb the mountain? So idea is you can have a cable car system that goes up to the telescope, then visitors can visit the telescope, and it's tourism for the country. So for example, for Kenya, and it's Tanzania governments to do tourism. And if you think about it in that way, that will bring a lot more money into the country than the science itself. So now you have money from the tourists part, the tourism part, and that can be used to help fund the science part as well. So that's another ways you can look to promote science as well. And for space exploration, the first private companies will do it, and they will do it for a certain reason, perhaps to go mine something to prove a point. But as soon as that is common practice, you'll be able to do more science and more people will be interested. Think about the space race in the 60s. A lot of people were interested in it. A lot of people watched it and were interested in it. And I think that's the idea what private companies is doing, is to get to that point.
I don't like that because if you're talking, first of all, just take the hike, get in shape, take the hike. Don't take the cable car. I don't like that. You don't get to look at the pretty pictures if you can't take the hike. I do 3 hours of cardio. Someone talks about doing a pill that can make you feel like you did 3 hours of cardio. No. Just do the work, do the effort. That's all I'm saying. Andrea, I haven't heard from you for a while. Did you have any points today?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of mixing academia with industry, and I mean, obviously there's a lot of mixing already, but you can see already, like for example in UK there is a big push of creating impact of your research, which is a very hard thing to do when you're an astronomer, right? You have to prove all the time that you make an impact on society with something tangible. I don't know, something that can be measured in a quantitative way. And of course, a lot of our progress in astronomy is intangible, but it is major, right? You just can't quantify it at the moment. It may be possible in the future. And I think some danger is that the blue sky research is kind of receding, because especially in times of crisis, when obviously there's big like we had, for example, COVID or any kind of major upheaval in the society, makes you question, do we actually need blue sky research? Do we actually need to know about the universe just for the universe's sake or anything like that? I think I would argue that these things are very important, right? And I think we have to be careful once we sell ourselves to companies like 100% and we jump on their boat. We have to be careful whether we will be able to keep the interest in science for science sake. That's my my take on it. But I'm not against progress or against people from different walks of life enjoying space and taking something out of space, not just scientific understanding, but obviously in the future science will be open for all kinds of ventures. I'm fine with that.
I agree with you. I think that's what I was saying as well too, when it comes to industry affecting kind of research in a sense as well too. I mean, you don't want to get all your funding from one institution, because then they can, I mean, it's industry funding research as well too. They can just skew your bias. I see plenty of that happen in academia all the time, but it becomes an issue when we're looking from an academia's or academic standpoint where the only lifeboat is a billionaire. And I think it does come from, we need more solid foundations when it comes to research institutions as well too. I mean, for me, I would give a tax exempt status. I would give it more like the same reason you could give religious purposes to some exemptions on things as well too. I mean, you're looking for origins that are only going to excel the knowledge of the human species. I mean, to me, that's a big event. But I also think that to get the public to see that as well too, there needs to be more interactions as well. I know NASA does a lot. I see them do a lot, but I also think it's like conversations like these necessarily, are they gonna go the way you think that they're gonna go when it comes to a specific subject, and they kind of cover all over, but it normalizes a lot of research and it helps people. Like, I'm learning a lot from this, and that's just things that, I mean, only get people more interested into the field and subject matter as well too. And there's not a whole lot of that really occurs. I mean, there's podcasts that are doing that. Some of them focus specifically on that. I know Coast to Coast does more alien and JFK stuff. Well, I like to do it too. But they also have research scientists on, and they have people explain, phenomena and more. They talk about some biblical stuff as well too. It's just an interest of interaction, I would say, when it comes to the general public getting into it. I mean, I would like more solid foundations when it comes to research, and academics being able to do it without a bias being implemented in, because I don't see business, when they say helping, I don't see it really heading in that direction. You're not going to fund a bunch of money to an institution unless you can somehow get what you want across. And we do see that happen a lot as well too. And there's big discoveries out there, as far as I can tell, that there's still stuff that we are trying to understand, and we're going to understand. I just want to make sure that it's headed in the right direction with it, not necessarily headed in the wrong direction. I mean, the idea of space tourism is cool. I'm not a huge fan of that. I mean, I would like people to go visit another planet, sure, but I see all the boats to get there are going to be in the pockets of people that are companies that are owned by billionaires that are just there to make a profit, not necessarily caring that you want to go see space. You know what I mean? Like, that's not wrong in me saying that, I don't think. I just think it's with every business. McDonald's didn't start being an evil corporation. It just, people hate them. I don't know, but they love the double cheeseburgers. I'm just saying, you don't start it with bad intentions. It just ends up leading there. And I think we can pull out a lot of examples. I think Elon does some good things, but I also see he does toss a lot of space junk up there as well too that does affect researchers. I mean, it's an unintended issue, but it's also an issue. And I think we have to look at all these things when we start talking about ideas of space exploration, because we want to make sure it's headed in the correct direction as well.
So I just wanted to agree with something Andreea said, which is about, there's a lot of bad things that have happened in the last couple of years. And I've noticed many of my colleagues are starting to question the value of their research in the face of that. With so many people suffering with COVID and many other things that have happened. And I agree with you. It is still very important. It does have a big impact on society. And one of my colleagues, she said something which I thought was really, really great. The way she worded it is, it's important to show that in a broken world that we can still do amazing and inspiring things. And so it's I think it adds a really positive aspect to the world, especially when things are going wrong, for lack of a better word. But to the space tourism thing, I worry about that as well. Like the whole concept of having a hotel on the International Space Station, things like that. The reason, I mean, I don't fundamentally have a problem with that kind of a concept, but what's going on at the moment is that would inevitably be seen as something as tourism for rich people only. It's kind of, if you've ever seen that Matt Damon movie Elysium, I think it's called, where you essentially have the rich people who are living in orbit and all the poor people who live on the Earth.
It's putting palm trees in your backyard if you live in Alaska. You don't get to do that. You just don't. I don't care how much money you have. I don't think that's smart.
Yeah. And so this is why there was such a divided response when people like Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk were having these highly publicized excursions into space. The reaction from some people was, yeah, that's really exciting. The reaction from many people that I saw was, oh my God, why aren't we taxing these people more? With this idea that they're doing that at the expense of paying taxes, and that once again ties into we're spending money on that when that money could have fed goodness knows how many homeless people. You
know what I want to capture is that moment he brought William Shatner. I guess they barely left the atmosphere or something like that. I think you just saw like where the blue line and then it becomes dark. Is that's the point that he got to? But when he came down and then William Shatner was messed up for like weeks after that, just crying and saying how beautiful it was. I want that in every single person when we see an image from whatever comes out of space. Like I just want people to have an interaction with it where there's a profound understanding and astonishment of that there's something bigger than us out there. And I understand there's important issues on Earth that you need to fix, but I also think that we're losing a big aspect when we just shut down the conversation. For instance, when you mentioned, speaking to someone about space, or did you know we just did this? Oh, that's cool. But what about the, inequalities here? I think that's an issue that needs to be addressed, but it shouldn't deflate the thing that we are doing in a massive scale way when it comes to space exploration. And I think that's kind of
like, I agree, because you've got to start somewhere.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately to get to the utopian scenario, it should be anybody should be able to go up and stay in a space hotel or something like that, not just a direct reflection of the wealth disparity.
Well, my first interest even into space was freaking Buzz Aldrin in his interviews saying that there's water on the moon and there's an obelisk on Mars. I'm like, hang on a second. I don't know what's true, but I'm just saying, like, I mean, that's it, the UFO topic, as much as I can say that it can help get people interested in it, it does supply a little bit of hurt too, because if what we've seen in the past couple of months when it comes to funding or when it comes into research has been always that question, what'd you see up there? Did you see any extraterrestrial life? It's like, I get that's an interest for a lot of people. It's an interest to me too, but I think we're basing it off of, did you see a UFO? Did you see any aliens in a saucer, rather than did you see, microbic life on another planet or something like that?
So one thing I can quickly mention, I just quickly brought it up here. One thing that's a positive note about private companies being involved in space exploration is the cost of getting into space is coming down exponentially. So here, quickly I open up an article. So Space Shuttle in 1981 to put 1 kilogram into orbit costs $85,216 per kilogram. If you go to Space Shuttle in 1995, the cost came down to $26,000.
Are you sharing screen?
I know. I can share a screen if you want to.
I want to see what you're seeing, man. I want to see that giant Bill Gates logo on the side of the thing. Just so
okay, let me share this. Let me quickly share my screen. Just opening it up. Hopefully, this image is not a bad quality. Where's that now?
I gotta talk to William Shatner on here.
You should be able to see my screen now.
Oh, I thought you were about to say I should be able to talk to William Shatner. I'm like, is he accepting that?
So here we can see space shuttle. So you can see in 2006, a Falcon 1 is roughly $10,000 per kilogram. The Falcon Heavy in 2020 is 951 kilograms per $591 per kilogram. So the cost is actually coming down. And that is one positive thing about privatization and industry in space. So you can get the cost down putting a kilogram in space. So that means for space tourism, yes, at the beginning, only the wealthy will be able to afford to take a holiday into space. But while technology is being furthered and improved, the cost for the average Joe to get into space will also become more affordable with time.
Does that specifically come from billionaires being more invested into it, or is that just like is this a time thing as well too? I mean, if you have one successful
That's
attempt, you
time,
don't just
and
stop at one.
yes, so that is from government and private industry and how technology advances. So one thing that we can think about why this becomes cheaper is because of reusable systems. So you think about SpaceX with them landing their rocket boosters and they're having reusable parts. So that means you don't just fire a rocket once and boom, it's over with. You actually recover the rocket and you reuse it, meaning you are saving a lot of money by reusing different parts and components. And that is what is bringing this cost down of getting stuff into space.
I like this idea that in about 40 years, you could buy a can of soda and for the same cost, send it into space.
Yes. So that is how one thing our technology is progressing, and that's one thing the general public don't also sometimes think about, is through space exploration, through space science, through astronomy, new and great technology is being developed and ends up in our palm, literally in the palms of our hands. So it won't fall the space race, if you think about it. One of the byproducts of the space race is your mobile device, your cell phone. And to use it, one of the other byproducts of the space race is our GPS systems and GPS networks that we can use every day. And that is something that people don't really think about and realize.
When I spoke with Avi Loeb on here, he talked about sending digital children into outer space. Would be the next kind of wave of where this would go. When we talk about the idea of, do you think space, it's going to be more of people going into space is going to be cheaper, or would it be better just for research purposes to have more types of technology that can be able to separate and gather more information about our universe? I mean, I would like to see it go that way before we send a bunch of people up there first. But also you look at an aspect of like, it's going to be a really dumb example, but like jet ski rentals. When I was a jet ski guide for a little while, we had to monitor rentals, people that would rent our jet skis and ride around in a certain area. You're telling me you can't have a drone with separate cameras that can all be modulated off of a person's phone? Someone can control their own camera, be able to look around space a little bit in the area that they want to go look around rather than just watching a video of someone doing it for them. I mean, I think that's a good way to get money as well too. I mean, obviously it would cost a little bit, but I mean, if you're paying by the minute, you know, you're gonna have people that are just gonna be interested in a couple minutes in space.
But one thing you can think about is sending out probes. A good example is Star Wars with the Galactic Empire. They sent out probes across the galaxy to look for the Rebel Alliance and the Rebel base. And as the probe finds something, then they will actually send the stormtroopers and Darth Vader to go investigate. And I see the same thing happening. So I like technology. I like to see technology going forward and being enhanced, and we developing better ways. So the cost of private industry bringing the viability to travel into space lower, so the average Joe can get into space. That is very cool. But with that as well, if we send out probes, for example, to the outer reaches of our solar system and even into deep space, that will help us determine where certain things are that we like to visit or investigate. But in the same time, that will bring the cost down for better drones here on Earth. For example, Amazon's drone delivery system that they are testing and playing around with, that is due to first the military being involved in creating drones, but now you can buy a drone and play with it in your backyard. And the same thing will happen through space exploration as well. The wealthy will be the only ones to be playing around with it and test it at first, but eventually the average Joe will also be able to do it as cost goes down.
You're telling me in the society we live in today, we can invent North Face jackets and Captain Crunch, but we can't attach a couple of GoPros to some things and just have the convention where people can control their own little GoPro and, you know, look around. I mean, I get like the 3D model thing is cool. You could do like see a picture and you can rotate it and see like a 3D, you know, view. of it. But at the same time, I mean, just to get the number of flat Earth people down a little bit, Jesus Christ, like just take a little, GoPro up there to show them, hey, look, you can control it. We're not showing or hiding anything. Look, and then they can look for themselves.
No, I agree. So that is one way you can do it. And as soon as, for example, you have more drones on take Mars, for example. I'm also a big fan of Mars. And usually when I think about Mars, the expanse usually comes to mind. But say, for example, you have a lot of drones on Mars and rovers, and you have photographed Mars, then what is stopping us for doing something like Google Street View? You can use your computer or a VR headset and you go into street view of a certain section of Mars.
Would they have location marks like that were like milestones, or like you go on Google Map, you can like click and zoom and it's like, hey, there's a 5-star restaurant on Mars.
That'd be cool. So I imagine it, if, for example, where the first rover touched down, that would be a marker where the current rovers currently are, and what is the historic points where we have touched down certain rovers on Mars.
I like that idea. Actually, that's actually a really good plot to a movie or a company if anybody wants to think about. Like, can you imagine Travelocity in space? Going a little bit off topic, sorry, bad joke. But I mean, just look at an aspect. I mean, when we talk about the ideas of where we're going to go, I mean, what would be the best method if we talked about more human exploration when it comes to the average public being introduced into space? Do you think that's something that could be, I guess, doable in a sense where it's not seen as like a billionaire industry? Like, could it be something where you could win a competition? I mean, we know people that win Nobel Prizes who aren't billionaires. Peace prizes, for instance, people that just do a significant event. I'm not saying you have to do a historical thing in your life that has changed society like Gandhi or anything, but maybe on the sense of just people that have made an achievement, maybe making it more acceptable when it's safer to be able to just show citizens or show people that they too can also venture into space. I've talked to a couple people who went through the astronaut training program, and like I mean, this is a while ago, probably 2 years ago. But their interest and love for it was because they went to the space museum and they got to explore and then get very interested into it. And I knew one person that actually went to one of those camps that they station out, like I think it's like Hawaii or something, and they get to sit in like this little thing and do one of those studies for like a month or so. See, you live with a couple other people. I think Space Force did like a version of that as well too. The show with Steve Carell. I'm not talking about the real Space Force. But I mean, that sparked hearing them talk about their experience there really sparked up interest them into wanting to pursue going into space and being an astronaut. I'm not saying you're going to get every single person to be an astronaut, but you're going to get a hell of a lot more people to understand and feel like they don't have to be of a certain wealth class to get involved into space travel.
Yeah, I think when those launches were happening from Branson and Bezos, I think it was Branson who suggested some kind of a lottery program where he might get people who wouldn't normally be able to afford it into space. But I really appreciated your point, Heystek, about the lowering cost of space travel. And when you were talking about that, I was thinking about, say, for example, like things that we now take for granted, like most people have a car, but there was a point in human history where owning, one of these horseless carriages was an extreme luxury. And so you really need to think about these things in terms of an investment in our future. And I think this is part of the issue with all these kinds of technologies. And so for space travel is people thinking about things that they won't necessarily benefit from in the near future, and perhaps not even in their lifetime, but future generations will benefit from enormously. And this is a general problem with space travel. Well, it has been historically because it's mostly been funded by governments. And when it comes to governments investing in space travel, there's a political aspect to that because, for example, a particular president or Congress might be investing in something that a future president will essentially take the credit for. So, for example, all of the initial work from JFK and that came to fruition mostly during the era of Richard Nixon. And so there's a discouragement there from political perspective about investing in long-term projects, meaning decades-long projects as opposed to short-term gains. But industry and companies that they do think long-term, and so they're more likely to go down that particular pathway.
I think
So anyway, yeah, there's this time scale thing that people need to wrap their heads around about what the long-term benefits will be. It's a difficult problem.
They can't be hypocritical about the timescale thing. See, people will fight the fight of climate change. The deal with climate change is that it's not, you're sacrificing to make your life harder, your kids' life harder for a better future for your grandkids. That's a lot of what people consider issues with climate change. I don't want to have to pay more. It's like, well, you're going to do better for your grandkids. Well, if you can take the same people that fight the fight of climate change, look at the examination of, you're probably not going to enjoy space luxuries, or your kids aren't going to enjoy space luxuries, but then your grandkids are really going to have an amazing time to be able to explore space and how far it really goes. I mean, it's the same thing. You can't be hypocritical and just want one, not over the other. I mean, I think we're pretty easy on that time thing. I get with the business, and that's an interesting thought. Or perspective that I really haven't heard of or even looked in before, which is the aspect of these industries that do stuff over a long time period change, is because mostly the times that their wealth or their business isn't going to be marginally impacted to a point, but it's going to get a giant payload down the road. It's kind of like burying a time capsule. I mean, you're not going to dig it up, but your kid's going to end up inheriting the business and he'll dig it up. So it's like that type of, I guess, mentality or talk. But I think it's easier to get probably the general public on board with just looking at a better future for future generations. There's a large impact with my age group that has this mentality of worrying about just our kids and our grandkids. I don't know why, because I hear a lot about phthalates and plastics, and apparently our fertility count's going down. So I'm just like, what grandkids? I don't know yet. It's hypothetical, imaginary, but I think it's important. I think you have a lot of kids, like, that's why they worry about inequality issues as well too. I mean, they're getting hopped into a lot of information that is now being given to them from cell phones and interactions. And most of these interactions happen to be through political discourse or things that are publicized on like television networks and stuff, which I just go, I mean, I would like to skew some of those days where they just do political discourses on television and skew it to more a research based. I mean, you can't just have it restricted to one channel like the Smithsonian. No, I don't even think I get that channel anymore. I'm pretty sure I just do Netflix and stuff, but Stranger Things is good at times. That gets you interested in space. You know, it's the sci-fi influencing society again.
Well, I'm not so concerned about the general public. I think from my interactions with the public, there's a lot of interest in astronomy, and it's always been. And you were asking about what are the ways of getting more people on board. I think we can keep all options open, right? I mean, I think it will always be this desire to send people into space just to show that we can, right? I think we'll suffer of a complex of inferiority if we always send probes, but we never go ourselves out there. But yeah, you're mentioning drones. I mean, what is the difference between a drone and a digital twin? There are extensions, there are technical devices we send to probe the universe and solar system and so on. I think that would be entirely feasible. I think that there's more questionable when this digital twins turn to AI. They have artificial intelligence, and then we'll have all sorts of problems of like what sorts of technology are sending into space, and do we enter into some competition with them and so on. But I think you were, just to go back to one of the earlier topics of discussion, what will take the humanity kind of unite? I think we had brief episodes of uniting. For example, when people set foot on the moon, right? It's not just the Americans that celebrated, but people all over the world, right? There was, and it wasn't planned. It just was spontaneous feeling of communion, if you like, with all the people on Earth. Everyone was watching, was stuck to the TVs and watching this. And another episode like that was when they turned the camera back on Earth, right? And we had the first image of the Earth from around the moon, and also that image of the Earth as a blue dot. the overview effect, we're right, that you mentioned that William Shatner was quite emotional after he came back. I think that is a genuine feeling, and people will experience that. So I think that the question is how you sustain this feeling of unity and bring everyone on board. I think that's probably harder to achieve. But we had experienced episodes where the whole world came together for a brief moment of time, and I'm sure that we will experience the same. For example, when we may detect some form of life or whatever on other planets, or even if we see these beautiful images from JWST, I think it's inspiring. It's not just inspiring for astronomers, but for anyone who watches this and understands what we're looking at. So
I'm hoping it's received and understood in that way. Is my whole point. I don't know how. I feel like with especially a lot of memory coming from my generation, and then one before me even. The one thing that I've always seen when people talk about a scenario where they got glued to their TV was like a 9/11 incident, where everyone remembers exactly where they were, exactly what happened, and was never taking their eyes off the TV as it was happening. I don't want it to just be a bad scenario that we feel like we need to have a historical event where we remember exactly where we were, exactly when. I think we should have got that same impact from Mars. It might have been a little bit differently because it wasn't a person landing there, but I just don't like. I'm just hoping that not been cut off completely when it comes to an aspect. It seems like obviously, tragedy sells. We've noticed that a lot as well too. But I want to make sure that we can get the same reaction when we do something great, or we at least pull that same reaction out of even what we would consider a small, but in a huge scale. If you know what exactly you're looking at, we can still pull that same impact, because having a bunch of memories or people that bring up an example of where they were when they were, and someone says a tragic incident like 9/11, that shouldn't be like that. We shouldn't just be receiving that off of bad things. We should be receiving that off of good things. So that's why I think my overall message in this whole chat has been like about the messaging, the connectivity with these aspects of things as well too, because there's a lot of great things happening. And I know we can talk about inequality. Sure, I'm not saying those don't exist, but man, with all the bad you get relayed, you got to look at the good as well too. But your wins should be celebrated the same aspect as much as you cry at the sorrows that go on. And I think you got to look at that too. It's why I get interested in all these space conversations. Yeah, I like to entertain it and probably pull you guys out of your comfort zones when we talk about a lot of space stuff. But that's the fun part in it. It's like I'm curious as hell. I got a lot of questions, and a lot of them look like they're on crack cocaine, but they're fun questions. They're really interesting stuff, and the public likes to hear that type of stuff, where I'm just hoping to spark interest as much as I've been getting fascinated in it as well too.
Well, so Robbie, that's an interesting point about that. That those moments, knowing where you were when that event happened, and the one that the positive one that people often think about in terms of a whole world response to it is, of course, the moon landing. And there's that famous broadcaster line from that about, for that brief moment in time, all of humanity was one. And something I'm really curious about is if and when, and I'm sure it's a question when. We do send a person to Mars, and that person first leaves a footprint on the red planet. If that will be a similar response, and how that will depend on if that is a company doing that. Like, let's just say that the first footprint of Mars is from none other than Elon Musk, right? He has built up SpaceX, this enormous company, and he steps foot on Mars, as opposed to it being a government or maybe even an international effort that makes that happen. What would be the difference in the cultural response? And I suspect, I'd love to hear the opinions of you guys on this, that it would be significantly more negative than the 1969 moon landing event if it was just somebody who spent billions of dollars getting there, as opposed to something that really is seen as an international effort. We'll see how that goes, but because it would be a shame, I think it would be a tragedy if the moment of that first footprint on Mars is not seen as a triumph for humanity. And my concern is that it won't be seen as a triumph for humanity. It'll just be seen as, oh, here we go again. The rich get richer, and we're still stuck here, with our problems on it.
If Elon lands on the moon first, the prophecy's completed, and we all need to stock up on beef jerky because the world's going to end. That was just a joke. Heystek, Andreea, you guys can answer that. And then I'll answer.
So I don't think it will be probably negative. So I like to see it. So for me, if I will, the example, Elon Musk put the first footprint on Mars. For me, I will see it as an accomplishment for humankind. It's a new step in a different direction. I would say that it's a new step for humankind to put a first person on Mars. And that will be a step for the first colony, for example, on Mars. So from my point of view is I don't see it as a industry or government. I would just like to see the first person on Mars. It doesn't matter who that person is affiliated to, or even if it is a global effort. It would be nice if it's a global effort, something to unite everyone on Earth more. But I think for something like that it will be a huge milestone for humankind. And I know, for example, the 1969 moon landing, it doesn't matter from which country you are from, that was a major achievement for humankind. And that was done by the US government. So, but it doesn't matter which country you are, everybody was excited. It's the first person on the moon. And I think it'll be the same effect as the first person on Mars. And even if we go back to the moon and have a new set of astronauts boots on the moon, that will be great. There'll be a new generation getting interested in space exploration and science and engineering. But it will be something for people to get excited about. And like you said, Robbie, for a positive event, a lot of people will remember that day, where they were, what they were doing, where they watched it from happening. For boots back on the moon, another person back on the moon, the first person on Mars. People will remember that as a big historic event.
Allegedly. I just
Well, I think probably, well, it's hard to anticipate what would happen, how the world will react, but it presumably will be like this panel, a bit mixed reaction. Some would be seeing it as an event for humanity, other people will be a bit more reserved. But I think this sending of civilians in space, it was a good training and see how the world will react. And all in all, the world didn't react as positively as it was expected, even by the billionaires. Sure, we sent some famous people out there, but we sent a lot of rich people and a lot of people who bought their tickets or they knew the the right person. So I think there was a missed opportunity in terms of, I think for humanity, I think it would have been better if the first event where we sent civilians in space would be, the first time we send civilians or in space would be a time where you send like regular people or people who, I don't know, I can't suggest any better way of doing it, but it's, to me, it seemed like a missed opportunity. This certainly is not the excitement of us going into space as it was predicted to be, even by people who were planning this for many years.
I'll say I raise one last question, and I also raise a Robbie scenario to end it on this. It's to all three of you. Do you think that the I guess the progression or the direction of what we would call success, in a sense, do you think it would be better, more calculated and precise? Or do you think it would be like this scenario, like when I was a kid and there was like 10 notches on my lawnmower and my dad's like, don't raise it above the second turtle notch? Or the lawn's going to look awful. And I ended up ramping it up to 10 and the lawn did, I mean, it looked good in my opinion, if you look at it from the side. But it didn't. It was all over the place because I did it way too fast. You think that should be like that? Do you think that the progression, direction we had space exploration or any aspect of space, do you think it should be more calculated and precise measures, carefully thought through? Or do you think some of the best innovations in society kind of have been not, I wouldn't say accidental, but necessarily not worried about precautions as much? And I think that lands into the area where we do talk about who directs the funding for space. Would you care for government or would you care for business to do that? And I found myself parted. I like the more precise measures, but I understand I've had over 1,000 something conversations with people from all over, and it's difficult to understand every single perspective. And I would think if you asked me that question of understanding people's perspectives, I couldn't tell you I would be comfortable enough to give you that answer, because I just don't. There's just things I can't think of. There's perspectives I haven't seen. So, I mean, I don't know. What do you guys think? You think more calculated or wild and out of control, like I did my lawn when I was like 15 years old?
So first of all, I love the analogy to lawn mowing. I spent a substantial amount of my youth cutting lawns and playing around with that, the height and making it look. As you say, I thought it looked good, but anyway. But I think it's kind of the truth is going to be somewhere in between the two scenarios that you're talking about. I mean, it is literally unexplored space. It is that frontier. Oftentimes we won't know the problems that we're going to encounter. For example, I think one of the things that we're still struggling to understand is the effect on human biology of spending extended periods of time in low gravity. I think this is going to be something that may present a challenge, for example, long-term human habitation on Mars, because that has 38% Earth's gravity. What is the long-term effects of that on human circulation, of the blood flow throughout the body, and other effects? Because we have evolved, over many millions of years to operate efficiently in one Earth gravity. So there's going to be a lot of challenges like that we'll face that we won't. It'll be very difficult to see them coming. And so, as much as we want to do it from calculated perspective as much as we can, I think there's going to be a very stochastic, meaning random nature to this, where we're going to inevitably encounter problems. But part of the driver, as we've been discussing over this podcast, the societal motivations, both from a government, broader society, and from a business perspective, those are going to ebb and flow through time. And I think that's going to create a certain amount of randomness to our approach to this problem as well. So, like I said, it's going to be inevitably somewhere in between.
If I might just add, I think the progress of technology is inevitable, and that will probably go at full speed no matter what. But I would like to see the discussion about space open up to the public. We mentioned the government and the companies, but the public is always the third actor, which is never into the conversation, is always talked to or talked at, but never involved in the conversation. And I was mentioning all these stories about the Milky Way, right? I mean, people always had the connection with the sky, and it's hard to reckon it today because we see it from such a science and technology point of view. But science has always been incorporated in culture, and we kind of lost that. And I think people need to feel a connection with the sky. And I would like to see that, the general public, and for us astronomers, the public we are funded by taxes and by the public, so we do have a duty to kind of get in conversation with the general public. I don't know whether we're doing it very well, but I think I would like to see the same discussion with the other actors involved in space, and it's not just from academia, but for everyone who is partaking into space. They should open up to a bigger conversation. Maybe it's very idealistic point of view, but I think that's probably one of the ways we could move forward.
You got yourself muted there, buddy. It happens to me sometimes
sorry,
too. I hit my vape sometimes and I have myself muted and I forget.
So I see it the same as Andreea and Steven. So the one thing is, I think space exploration and directions is going to be, they're going to try and keep it precise and calculated, because you don't want to have mistakes happening. You're still working with, for example, people's lives, and it still costs a lot of money to do this research. But you're going to encounter some situations where it's going to be a total unknown, and then you cannot plan for it, and you just have to see what happens. And to end off this question, I have a quote and a joke. So the quote is of Brian Greene. So when kids look up to great scientists the way they do to great musicians and actors, civilization will jump to the next level. And I think that is something to think about. And the other thing is quite a joke. Science can tell you how to clone a Tyrannosaurus Rex, but humanities can tell you why that might be a bad idea.
I appreciate the conversations from the bottom of my heart, of you guys joining me and entertaining me in the episodes of my show that you guys have been involved in. I generally respect your guys' opinions, and knowledge obviously is way past mine in this field and probably other fields as well too. But it does mean a lot, just being from the general public. I thank you. Stephen, if you want to say your links, Andreea, you can say your links, and Heystek, we'll end with you, man.
So you can.
Oh, Stephen goes first. Heystek, you'll be the
Okay,
last.
sorry. Okay, cool.
Well, I was just going to say that people can easily find me by googling my name, Stephen Kane, and I have a website where people are welcome to contact me. I'm also on Twitter, Exocytherian, if people wanted to follow me there.
Oh, sorry. Heystek, right?
No, it's Andreea.
Me? Okay. So I do have a website. Again, people could just Google me, Andreea Font. Twitter handles again, Andreea Font. I don't usually keep up on my websites up to date, so these two I think will be enough.
Heystek.
Yeah, people can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by just typing in my name and surname as one word, so at Heystek Grobler.
The way I'm doing this is how my boxes are set up. It's going clockwise, so you'll see it when the video goes out and everything. But if you are looking for me, you can find me where you just found me. So appreciate the time that you guys have given me, and thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank. And stay tuned for next episode.